Thank you very much to the sponsors of tonight's event. Thank you very much, Marianne, for your energy and enthusiasm, the invitation to come and speak. Now I can really use. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. My name is Scott Bruce. I'm a professor of medieval history at Fordham University in the Bronx. I'm a specialist on the history of medieval Christianity, but I'm also interested in many different aspects of ancient and medieval popular culture, what we would call popular culture, and in particular, dragons. So my presentation tonight is really about the history of dragons, with a little bit of an emphasis on St. George and how that story has changed. I'll do my very best to keep within 25 minutes or so, and then that will leave time for questions at the end. Let's see. There we go. It will be a very short history of dragons. Much of the information I'm about to tell you tonight comes out of the anthology that I did for Penguin Classics, the Penguin Book of Dragons. There's copies of it up front if you're interested in the history of these amazing creatures. Something that we all think. I think it's very, very hard to not be exposed to dragons in this day and age. Now, I'm in my 50s, older than some of you, back in the age before universal access to all media. If you're my age, you probably remember your first encounter with dragons in one way or another, and I'd ask you to actually take a second and think about that. When do you remember first seeing a dragon? What was it? Was it in a film? Did you conjure it from an image in a book? Did you hear the song Puff the Magic Dragon, made popular by Peter, Paul, and Mary in the 1960s? We all have that kind of moment when we're children, when dragons come into our imagination. And that's a very powerful moment. The image of the dragon sticks with us. For me, growing up, like I said, in the 1970s, these were the images that captivated me. Earl Otis's painting of a dragon from an early Dungeons and Dragons set, and then this wonderful dragon from the Ray Harryhausen film, The Seven Voyages Sinbad, created in 1958, but a pretty regular feature on Sunday afternoon television when I was growing up. So these are what I would call my lower school dragons. But then, when I became a reader, a pretty voracious reader, there was no dragon as powerful in my imagination as Smaug from J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit, wonderfully painted by Tolkien himself in this edition. So these are these are the dragons that formed my imagination, or that informed my imagination, and they carry all the attributes of an European dragon. And that is, they have wings, they breathe fire, sometimes they talk, and this is what many of us, at least in North America, grow up with. But one of the reasons I wanted to do the Penguin Book of Dragons, to create an anthology of historical sources about this fantastic creature, was that I knew that my dragon was a very culturally specific dragon, and that every culture seems to have dragons, yet every culture also inflects dragons to tell their own stories. So dragons from other cultures, from non-Western cultures, for instance, are very different from the ones that I grew up with, and perhaps the ones you grew up with too. And in doing so, the Penguin Book of Dragons makes an argument that dragons are actually culturally distinct. There's no worldwide uniform notion of what a dragon is. And I guess in doing so, if the Penguin Book of Dragons has an argument, it's that it's against David Jones's book, An Instinct for Dragons, which came out about 20 years ago. Jones is an anthropologist who argued that we fear dragons and we imagine dragons in the way we do because they are an amalgam of the kind of apex predators that primitive human beings feared. They have talons like birds, they are reptilian like snakes, and they are, we would say they're raptor-like, like giant cats. So Jones's thesis is that the dragon is simply an amalgam of all of these predators that we feared before we became the apex predators. And in this, I don't agree with him, in part because dragons in other cultures do not have these characteristics. They are not always predatory or aggressive or things like that, as we'll see. So, there are a few, what I'll say, there's a few different rules about dragons, or as I call them, the laws of dragons. And the first law of dragons in the history of dragons is that they are always remote in time. When people talk about dragons and tell dragon stories, they're almost always telling stories of things that happened long ago. And so, not surprisingly, even when ancient people told their stories tend to be set in mythical times, again, long before they were born or long before their time in particular. Very good example of a challenge to our presumptions of what a dragon looks like. Ancient dragons, and by that I mean Greek and Roman dragons, were almost always not winged. They never spoke, and they never breathed fire. They had the three different attributes that I picked out for the Western European dragon, the Northern European dragon, were not at all popular in the ancient world. Rather, these were almost always giant serpents. And so important was this image for ancient people that they actually named a constellation after them, an undulating constellation of stars that is still up there, right? The constellation Draco. This is an image from a medieval manuscript. But here is actual an astronomical chart that shows Draco in the sky. And again, you get the sense, you can even get the sense from this image that what we're dealing with here when we talk about a dragon, a Draco, is a giant snake. Some of the most famous stories from antiquity that talk about dragons of this kind are, for instance, the story of Cadmus and the dragon. Now, Cadmus is not an ancient hero that we know very well, not many of us anyway. His story was relatively new to me. Cadmus then goes and does battle in modern English. It's to undertake something that has a troubling end, an end that's not good. So this story just lives on in that way. An aberrant giant snake in the tradition, who's also referred to as a Draco, is the Hydra, who is defeated by the demigod Hercules. It's the second labor of Hercules to fight the Hydra. It's a difficult task for him, in no small part, because every time Hercules kills one of the Hydra's heads, it grows 2 more. It begins with 9 heads, but it just keeps growing, right? They keep more and more heads. This vase depicts the Hydra again as a giant multi-headed serpent, whom Hercules finally defeats when he realizes that if he applies fire to the stump of the heads that he has bashed with his club, they will no longer regrow. So, ancient people told old stories about giant serpents that they referred to as dragons. And like I said, they're always active far in the past. The second law of dragons is that they're always remote in space. That is, they're always far from where people are. And it's understandable, right? We can imagine we are familiar with our own locale, and then we push the exotic and the monstrous to the margins of our societies and to the margins of our ecosystems as well, I guess. We see this particularly in early medieval Europe, when early medieval people described monsters like dragons, their habitat was never in Europe, right where they lived. It was almost always in an exotic locale. And for medieval Europeans, those exotic locales were Africa and India, far from the heartlands of those authors. Some of the wonderful images that come out of this tradition includes this one. Here we see a dragon wrapping itself around an elephant. Now, elephants were equally strange and bizarre to Western medieval people, right? There were no elephants in Western Europe. So here we have a confluence of these 2 different traditions. And why they made the trees look like asparagus, I really don't know, but that was pretty common for medieval artists. So medieval people believed that dragons did exist in these exotic locales, India and Africa, where their proximity to the equator and the constant sunshine made it very warm. And they believed that dragons laid in wait for elephants and wrapped themselves around them and fought them and killed them by suffocation. They themselves would be trampled or crushed when the elephant fell down and died, so it was not a good situation for either of the animals. And this is part of medieval lore. One of the reasons why this story stuck around is that Christian authors allegorized it. The elephant was, according to Christian authors, a human soul. The dragon who lay in wait for the soul and sought to wrap around it and suffocate it was nothing less than the devil itself, right? Who sought to ensnare souls and to lead them and to kind of trap them in vice. So what begins as a natural story about a monstrous creature that lives far away becomes an allegory for the situation of Christians who are tempted by the devil. And this is another way that dragons live on in this tradition. Of course, the alliing of the notion of this reptilian creature with the devil goes all the way back to the recognition, or at least the identification, of the snake in the Garden of Eden as being a representation of the devil as well. Well, the third law of dragons is that they are almost always didactic. In ancient and medieval stories, they're almost always there to impart a lesson, to tell a story. They represent more than just a simple animal or creature. We see this in a number of different stories that I'll move through pretty quickly. The first and probably most famous is, of course, the Beowulf poem, an Old English poem that was written around the year 750 CE. It survives in a single manuscript that was written around the year 1000. And this story has had the greatest impact on our understanding and perception of dragons in the Western tradition. The story goes as follows. A dragon finds a treasure hoard that is long forgotten, and it curls up and falls asleep on the hoard, where it sleeps for hundreds of years, until a thief, depicted here in a children's version of this from the early 20th century, comes and steals one tiny little part of the hoard, a little cup, and makes his way out. And this angers the dragon, who then wakes up, flies out, and wreaks havoc on the local communities. This is a northern Western European dragon. He flies, he breathes fire, although this one doesn't talk. And then a great king, Beowulf, does battle with the dragon, slays it, but also dies in the fight. And so this becomes a standard motif in Western literature. The dragon guards treasure. The dragon is a hoarder of treasure. But if we can unpack this very quickly by thinking about the role of treasure in Anglo-Saxon society, in the society of the people that tell the story. And this was a society of kings who were, generally speaking, the leaders of war bands. And their followers, the warriors who followed them and who kept them in power, only did so because those kings were the sharers of wealth. They're one of the synonyms for the word for king in Old English is ringgiver, right? The wealth that they had was not wealth that they hoarded, it was redistributed to their followers. So you followed someone because you knew you were going to get the wealth that you obtained through battle, because the king would give it to you. So the dragon in this case, the significance of the dragon hoarding wealth is that the dragon is not allowing that wealth to circulate. The dragon is actually kind of not, he's depriving the king of his ability to rule and have an effective, loyal following, because the wealth he's guarding is not allowed to exchange hands. So there's more to the story here than meets the eye. And again, going back to the notion that these stories always take place in the past, even though the story was being told written down in the 8th century, the opening lines of the poem say, a long time ago, or once upon a time, right? So even they were projecting their story of the dragon further back. Another story, actually that doesn't project too badly. You can see, so this is now an ancient, medieval Persian story. You can see the 3 riders on horseback and the dragon threatening them on that side. And again, here are the 3 horsemen and the dragon there. This dragon is not what it seems. This story from the Book of Kings, a medieval Persian story, is about a king named Feridun and his 3 sons. Now his sons did not yet have names, even though they were young men, and he sent them off to find wives for themselves from the Persian capital into Yemen. And on the return from Yemen, the king disguises himself as a dragon. That is, he casts a magic spell so he appears as a dragon, and he confronts his 3 sons in order to see how they're going to react. And their reaction will determine to him which one of them should rule. Now, of course, they all react very differently. One of them is very aggressive and wants to fight the dragon. One of them is very cowardly and wants to flee the dragon. And the other one takes a middle ground and says, don't you mess with us, dragon, because you don't know our dad. He's the king. When the three boys return home, he then gives them their names. One of them he calls Saum, which means safety. This was the coward, right? He wanted to run away. Not a bad idea, really. The next one he called Tur. This was the aggressive son, whose name means bravery. But it was the youngest son, the son who did not run and did not fight, but warned the dragon of the noble people he was facing, who becomes known as Iraj, which is the word for noble in medieval Persian. But here the dragon is more emblematic of a kind of threat that brings out the character in heroes. And again, in story after story, dragons are there primarily to accentuate the heroic qualities of the people who are forced to face them. And now, and again, just to get a kind of global perspective on this, we'll turn now to early modern Japan, and this wonderful illustration of the story that is known as My Lord Bag of Rice. It's a very odd title, I admit, but if you were to pick out the dragon in this picture, which of the four figures represents the dragon here, you might be surprised to learn that it is the woman and that man who are the dragons. They are not the adversaries in this story. And in fact, the monster, the hideous monster there, is not a dragon at all, but a giant centipede. In this story, a warrior named Fujiwara Hidesato is crossing a bridge where a reptilian serpent is lying. And he decides he can either turn back or he can walk over it and try not to wake it up. And being a brave warrior, he decides to walk over it. This dragon then approaches him and said, "You've been the only one brave enough to step over me. I really need your help." And this is like unheard of in Western stories about dragons. And the warrior agrees to help him. So he goes to the kingdom of the dragon, which is under the sea, because dragons in Japanese culture are almost always aquatic, where the dragon has a palace, and he's served by all sorts of fish, and he has a family, and he lives basically like a nobleman. And he tells the terrible story of this giant centipede that has taken up residence nearby, who comes every night and eats one of his children. And the dragon is terrified because he doesn't know what to do about this. So the human warrior in this case helps the dragons by fighting the giant centipede. The secret, of course, you probably already know this, is that human saliva is poisonous to giant centipedes. So all he has to do in the end is lick his arrows and shoot the giant centipede with his arrows, and he manages to kill it. And in return, when he frees the dragon from this kind of tyranny, he is given all these magical gifts, including a bag of rice that never empties, so he will never go hungry. I'll move on very quickly and just to conclude with the St. George stories. Now, the story of St. George is well known in the Western tradition. A pagan king his kingdom is being threatened by a dragon, and he has to give it people to eat to placate it. So there's a lottery, and this goes fine until the king's daughter is chosen in the lottery. She has to go be eaten by the dragon. Luckily, St. George comes by, slays the dragon, or doesn't slay the dragon. He defeats the dragon. It becomes docile. The girl puts her girdle around the dragon's neck and leads it back to town. And St. George says he'll kill the dragon if they all convert to Christianity, which they usually do. Here's some classic medieval images from the story. You can see exactly what's going on. This story, though, was appealing not just to male readers, but also female readers. Here, a book of hours from the 15th century, which was clearly made for a noble woman. You can see that the story is taking place within the window there. And the girl, who is the king's daughter, the princess, is mirrored on the outside in the marginarium, laid out by an image of the woman whose manuscript it is, right? And here, the whole thing takes on a different meaning. The dragon in this case, this is the only dragon image I've ever seen, certainly in Western art, where the dragon actually has genitalia, male genitalia. And here, the dragon is not just a monster to be defeated. It's a representation of sexual vice that is being overcome by the night. This image becomes, the image of George slaying the dragon becomes ubiquitous in Western culture, and it's probably depicted more so in the 19th century than many other kind of pseudo-medieval images. And it's at this point in the 19th century where the image so saturates the imagination that a children's children's author named Kenneth Graham decides to lampoon it in a story, a really charming story. It's one of the last stories in the book, actually, called The Reluctant Dragon. And in this story, a boy befriends a dragon who's living in the English countryside, and it's a rather intellectual, bookish kind of creature, and who doesn't want to fight. And so when they catch wind that St. George is coming to slay the dragon, they have to have an aside with St. George to convince him that the dragon is actually peaceful. St. George is in on the game. He and the dragon decide that they will have a mock battle where the dragon only pretends to die. Here's George inspecting the dragon as they're getting ready for the mock battle. And in the end, they agree to cooperate. And so that the dragon essentially can live happily ever after with the boy. And this, written in 1898, heralds what becomes the dominant feature of dragons in the literature of the 20th century, which is dragons as allies. How to train your dragon. Dragons are our friends. And which have become very, especially the How to Train Your Dragon series by Professor Powell becomes a very famous series of movies as well, which my children love. But so it's nice. We have a happy ending. The very last picture in The Reluctant Dragon finds our three heroes, St. George, the dragon, and the little boy wandering off, singing an old song together. And the book ends by saying, I can't be certain which of them was singing, but I think it was the dragon. So a charming end. We're in a very good spot now with our dragons in the Western tradition. Thanks in part to the cooperation of St. George. But if there's a moment for questions, I'm happily answer any questions related to this stuff. We're happy to move on to those or speak to.
We'd love to ask you about everything, but I don't have that time.
Well, that's all right.
That is so magnificent. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.